Nestojko is here with us today to talk about cognitive illusions, understanding the tricks our minds can play. He earned his Ph.D. in psychology with a major in cognitive psychology and a minor in developmental psychology from the University of California, LA. He is currently a postdoctoral research associate with the Memory Lab in the Department of Psychology at Washington University here in St. Louis. Dr. Nestojko's research explores the dynamics of human memory retrieval and aims to eliminate the processes and mechanisms involved in retrieval. And he is currently investigating the interplay between testing and studying as learning events. On behalf of Oasis and the Academy of Science St. Louis, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. John Nestojko.
Good morning, and thank you for coming today. Can you hear me well?
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I think a couple inches taller than her. So by way of introduction to the topic today, I want you to focus for just a moment on the image on the screen. This is an example of a perceptual, or optical in this case, illusion. Some of you have probably been looking at this already. Does anybody want to volunteer what they see on the image on the screen? Now, if you look at this image, and let your eyes sort of drift across it a little bit. Try not to focus on any one point, any one place in space for too long. And you should notice something a little tricky. Yes?
I see 13 swirls.
Okay. And when you say swirls, what do you mean by swirls?
Well, I see 13 center points.
Okay. Does anybody see motion in this image?
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you see motion. Yeah. So one of the reasons I printed it out, like I said, is because it may work better up close, but the other is because I want you to believe me when I show you these illusions today. Some of them are going to be a little unbelievable. And on screen, if you see these swirling, you might think I'm a tricky computer guy and I'm making these actually turn via a movie or something. But you can see it on paper as well. So this is a completely static image. With this particular illusion, we're not 100% sure why this happens. But part of the storyline I'm going to convey to you today is that these errors of the way we think aren't just errors, they're in fact part of an adaptive system that's developed to help us navigate a relatively complex world. So these illusions happen because our minds are doing the right thing most of the time, and every now and then the wrong thing. Just as a quick sidestep, I gave you in that packet, the last page, a few resources. This Dr. Michael Bach is one of the websites that I put on there because he has a lot of these illusions in case you want to look some of these and many, many more up later. So here's the typical sort of introduction slide. You know, the top today is cognitive illusions, understanding the tricks our minds can play on us. To understand what I mean by cognitive illusions, though, I first want to introduce the topic of cognitive psychology. Now, to get there, I want to first show you a short video. This image is one done by Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance period. Now, as it is, it looks like a sketch of sort of nothing, almost like he was testing out his pencil to make sure that it had enough charcoal or lead, whatever he used. But when turned the right way, to the appropriate angle, when the paper this was drawn on is turned to the appropriate angle, we see something else. We see an image of the human eye. Now this is, I'm using this example here for a couple of reasons. One is to say that artists and scientists and people for many, many years have realized these illusions occur and have been very interested in them. And throughout the talk, I'll throw in a few images from artists because I think that's one of the more fun ways these illusions can be played with. But I also say this, I also use this example to get across the point that what we perceive is driven only in part by our sensory organs, by the eye, for example, taking in information from the world. But it's what's behind the scenes that really does a lot of the heavy lifting to help us interpret the world around us. And it's, in fact, the study of those behind-the-scene processes that we call cognitive psychology. So the scientific study of mind and mental processes. Cognitive processes are those processes involved in knowing. In particular, cognitive psychologists tend to focus on one of four main areas. Perception, so like I said, using our sensory organs, vision, hearing, etc. Attention, so how do we focus what we're paying attention to right now? You are hopefully attending to me rather than your phones or something out there. You're able to do that relatively well. Memory, so how do we acquire and retain information, and why does that fail sometimes? And that's really my area of expertise, as well as Dr. Roediger's. And thought, how does this all come together to help us make decisions when faced with choices? So those are the 4 cognitive processes. Now before I get a little more into that, I want to guide you a little bit to step back from our normal everyday experience. It's very easy to take for granted the fact that when we open our eyes, we'll see a relatively organized scene in front of us. You can tell that this podium is an object, that you know the top of this won't just come off if I lift it. Well, you also know that if I pick it up, it will come off the ground. You also know, hopefully, that I am an entire man, not just the top of me that you see. Why do you know these things? Well, you've learned things over the course of your lives. Your mind has picked all this information up, and there are some things that we're born with inherently to help us understand that when an object is occluded, blocked by something for a moment, it doesn't mean that object ceases to exist. It's still there. Those of you in the back of the room probably see me as quite a bit smaller than I am. You're 30, 40 feet away from me. But you know that I'm actually a normal-sized man, not a tiny man inches from your face. And you know that because of depth perception. Now, all I'm going through here is just about visual processing and how we take in this massive amount of visual information every single moment of our waking lives that our eyes are open. And while we're doing that, our mind has to organize that information in a way that makes it so we can use it and guide us through the world. Now again, there are other senses, and there's other forms of information. So take all of that together and think about the complex activities that our mind must be doing to help us actually navigate this world successfully. I say all of that because I want you to believe that our minds are doing a very good job of this most of the time, and they in fact are. But it's also the case that these same processes are what's behind the illusions that I'm going to talk about today. One more side note before I go into this is I want to define one more term, cognitive neuroscience. Now you've probably heard the term neuroscience lately in the media in the past few years. It's been gaining a lot of steam and for good reason. Neuroscience is the study of the brain, of neural pathways, of how the brain actually, the structure and function of the human brain. Now cognitive psychology is more about the abstract version of that, the mind. So I don't study function and structure, yes.
Does dyslexia fall into this perception of what you see about?
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I'm not well versed on research
I
on
worked with a
dyslexia.
little dyslexic boy, and that's what we...
I think that it's probably, I'm going to guess that dyslexia is due to something of a processing disruption. I would doubt that it's something due to a disorder of the eyes, for example. It's probably somewhere along the stream in the mind, in the brain, where information is processed, something is twisted and turned around. But I'm sorry, I don't know that. I do have my email on there. Feel free to email me questions, and I can always dig up answers.
Okay.
I'm happy to do that. So cognitive neuroscience is simply the neural basis of cognitive processes. That's bringing neuroscience and cognitive psychology together. I won't focus on that much more today, but I just wanted to get over that hump so that when I talk about the mind today, you know where I'm coming from, rather than talking about the brain in most cases. So as I was saying, though, these processes, these cognitive processes really allow us to navigate the world, but sometimes when certain configurations of features in our environment occur, our brains can be fooled, and so there can be these cognitive illusions or these systematic distortions in the processes of knowing. And these occur in all 4 of the areas of cognition that I mentioned. So there are perceptual illusions, and those are some of the more fun ones, so I have quite a few of those in the talk today. There are illusions of attention. There are memory illusions, in fact. And there are illusions of thought. I have examples of all of these, and I hope to get to all of them before the talk is over. Now, all of these confront this crucial distinction between appearance and reality, between truth and illusion. There is an objective reality you can measure and that is knowable, and we're often very good at interpreting that reality to be matching up with what is out there. But sometimes our subjective experience is a little bit askew. One more side step before I get right into the illusions. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my area of expertise, about human memory. This is a very typical model used by researchers, and it's, I think, very useful to think about how memory works. There are 3 stages in the learning process: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And many of you may have heard this kind of thing before. Encoding is simply original learning or acquisition of information, whether that be a student reading a chapter from a textbook for a course, or it may be the first time you meet another person. It may be somebody trying to learn Italian because they're going to take a vacation to Rome sometime soon. All of those are encoding events. Now, after encoding, until we use that information, that's really storage. We have to keep that information, maintain it over some time. But at some point, we'll be called upon to access that stored information, and that's what we call retrieval. Now, in the laboratory, researchers like myself and Dr. Roediger study memory usually by mapping our experiments straight onto these 3 phases of encoding, storage, and retrieval. The encoding phase, we give our participants, oftentimes college students, some study material. Now, this could be a list of numbers, oftentimes it's a list of words, it could be videotape, etc. We've used all kinds of things across the history of human memory research. And then the retention interval represents the storage phase, and that just means that we give them some time before we test them. And that could be 10 seconds, it could be 10 minutes, 10 days, 10 weeks, etc. Although most of it's studied on a relatively short scale. And then retrieval is simply how we test them. So there are a variety of different kinds of tests. I have 3 up here. The 2 that are most commonly used are what are called recall tests. And that's when we simply ask the participant, can you please tell me everything you remember from the study event? That's what's called free recall. Sometimes we give them what's called cued recall, where we give them some cue, or we ask them a direct question. But they still have to dig into their memory to find the answer and produce it. So that's recall. And the difference between that and recognition is that recognition tests take the study material, what they learned. So say they learned 10 Italian terms yoked to their English terms. Well, we'll give them those Italian terms again, but we'll give them new words as well that they haven't studied yet, and we ask them the question for each word one at a time: is this a word you studied before, or is it a new word you did not study today? And so they have to say, yes, this is a new word, or this is an old word, or no, this is a new word. And that's a recognition test. Now, I have to admit I'm being a little bit sneaky. Part of why I'm explaining this is because I'm now going to run you through a memory experiment. It's fine. This shouldn't harm you in any way, and I'm not going to take any real data, and nobody's going to. But
you grade on a curve.
For you, sir. So what I'm going to do is read a relatively short list of words, just over a dozen words, one at a time. I'm going to read them at a fairly fast pace, not too fast, about 2 seconds per word. And when I'm done, we'll move on to something else, and I will later test your memory for those words. Okay? Is everybody ready? Whether you are ready or not, I am going to start. Here we go. Bed. Rest. Awake. Tired. Dream. Wake. Snooze. Blanket. Doze. Slumber. Snore. Nap. Peace. Yawn. Drowsy. Okay, now I'm going to give you what we call a retention interval, which means that I'm not going to test you for just a little while. Sometime later in the talk, I will test your memory for those words. For now, I'm going to give you a slightly different test.
this is unrelated to the list we just read. This is a new thing. I'm going to demonstrate another illusion now. What I'm going to do is place a sentence on the screen, and I'm going to read that sentence at a normal pace. While I'm reading it, I want you to read it silently to yourselves, as if you're just reading it for comprehension. But while you do that, reading normally, I want you to count the number of F's that occur in this sentence. Now, don't say anything just yet out loud. I will ask you afterwards how many F's you saw, not while we're reading, please. Okay, here we go. Finished files are the result of years of scientific study combined with the experience of many years. Now, don't say anything just yet. I'm going to go one number of letters at a time. So if you saw 2 F's on that screen, please raise your hand. Okay. If you saw 3 F's, please raise your hand. If you saw 4 F's, please raise your hand. 5, 6, 7. Okay. Good. So Dr. Roediger has done this demonstration dozens of times over the course of something 10, 15 years, and in his undergraduate courses, he actually writes down the number of people who respond to each choice. And so over all those courses that he's done that in, he has percentages of his audience that say that they saw 2 letters, and 5% of his audiences on average say that. And that seems to match up pretty well with what I just saw. A bit over half of the audience says they saw 3 letters. And 12% say they saw 4, 5% say they saw 10, or I'm sorry, 10% say they saw 5, 11% say they saw 6, and 1% say they saw 7. That may not match perfectly with what we just did, but I'll say from watching the crowd, that's pretty close. I'd say that a bit over half of you said there were 3 letters. But the answer was actually 6. Now here's what happened. Those are the 3 letters you probably noticed if you were in the group that said 3, right? Those are the sneaky other 3 letters. Now I'm not doing this to make you feel bad about yourself. I want to tell you that I saw this the first time and said, wait, what? No, there were only 3. I practiced for this talk today ran this, I had my wife go through this, and she said, no, there were only 3, and I had to show her the sentence again to have her believe me. This is very common. Like I showed you, more than half of the people in the audiences across many, many times of doing this say there are 3 letters. Now, why is this? Is everybody, or the majority of people, I should say, sort of a fool here? And the answer is no. In fact, this happens because we're extremely well-versed at reading. We have, over the course of our lives, become very, very facile with reading. And so imagine that we weren't quite as good at reading. Imagine that you're 6 or 7 years old and you're just sort of getting the game of reading down. Well, you tend to pay more attention to things like what letters are there and how to sound out a word and the number of syllables and all those sort of low-level surface features that by now we can all ignore and just get the meaning of that sentence. And it turns out that in fact 6 and 7-year-olds who are given this same task outperform all of us. They get their 6 F's because they're very slowly plodding through this and paying attention to each piece at a time, but it takes them quite a bit longer to read anything. And if we didn't develop this expertise with reading, we would not have the society that we know today, right? So, in fact, this error is one sign that we are experts at this task. And that's part of the message I want to convey today, is that's what causes most of these errors, or a lot of these errors. One way to think about this. So the lesson I'll give you from this is that if a group of people look at the same scene, they oftentimes see different things. An addendum to that, though, is that we can often see the same scene more than one way. So you may see in a scene one thing the first time you see it, and then seconds later see a different thing. Now, one of my favorite artists of all time, in fact, for this exact reason, before I ever got interested in this, was Salvador Dali. Partly because he has these dual images within many of his paintings. This is one example of at least a dozen that I know of where he does exactly this. Now, does anybody want to venture what they see here? Yes.
I see a woman in a doorway.
You see a woman in the doorway back here. Okay. Yeah. You see a guitar. Okay. There's a guitar here. Now, does anybody see a different scene? Yeah. Okay. So none of you are seeing the wrong thing. You're all in fact seeing the right thing. Yes.
A vase or something.
Yeah. A face.
A vase.
Oh, a vase. Oh yeah. This middle scene here. It looks something like a vase, right? So again, we can all see somewhat different things. Now, the two main scenes that Dali was depicting here are this woman here, that's her entire face, and her shoulder, and her earring, and her eye. Her eyebrow, in fact, here is the hat of another woman who's sitting down, and here's her knee, and the creases in her clothing are, in fact, the creases in the woman's face. And the older gentleman here who's looking into his wife maybe's eyes, and here's his hair, but that's actually the background, the doorway that has this other woman there. His mustache is the guitar being played by the gentleman here who wears the hat that is actually this man's eyebrow. It's pretty clever, right? And it's not that Dali came up with some new thing that, he was a genius, but he was capitalizing on an observation that we as humans can see different scenes in the same scene. Now, why is it that way? I think, again, that it's because our mind is constantly striving to organize the information in the world around us, and it has to choose which thing to focus on right now to make sense of this. And so it sees, out of essentially a bunch of paint strokes, one of two different scenes. I'll show you one more, just briefly, because it is one of my favorites. This is another Dali, swans reflecting elephants. On this picturesque pond, there are 3 swans bathing on a nice blue sky day. But reflecting in that pond are the ears and trunks of 3 elephants that look strikingly like those swans. Like I said, I really enjoy Dali's work for this reason. So, as I mentioned, we can often see the same thing more than one way. I'm going to move on to a different set of illusions now. This is a texture gradient size illusion. And what does that mean? So does anybody want to, actually let me frame it a little bit. So in this scene, what I see and what I'm hoping you see actually is that this cylinder here is the smallest of the group. This one back here is the largest of the group, and this one here is the middle-sized cylinder. Now, does everybody perceive basically that? Not really. It's a little bit subtle. So if you don't see that, then this is a little less convincing. But essentially, that's how most people perceive this, at least when up close a little more. The trick is these are actually, in fact, all the same size cylinder. Now, they're all the cylinder of this size. And I'll show you that with this animation where the cylinder goes from one to the next and hovers over it. Now, why does this happen? Again, this is our mind trying to do the work it's intended to do. It's trying to interpret a 2-dimensional scene as a 3-dimensional scene. That's how we evolved, that's how we developed, is to interpret this 3-dimensional reality we live in, but artists can render paper to represent a 3-dimensional scene. So they basically have to lie to the mind, and they do that with, in this example, creating the illusion of this long hallway. And for these 3 objects to be of about the same size as we perceive it, well, our mind knows that means this back one has to actually be much larger than it appears if it's farther back from this one.
So an artist would make the largest one in front as a new perspective and draw a horizon line. So
right.
They would be reversed.
Right. If he intended those, he or she intended those to be perceived as the same size object. Yeah. If he wasn't trying to fool us a little. So yes, this is a bit of a contrived example, but here, because of exactly that, because if we saw this one as largest, and this one is a bit smaller, and this one is a bit smaller, we might say, oh, they are the same size. But the fact that they look to be the same size, you might interpret that as, or your mind might interpret that as, that means this one must be bigger. When we take the scene away, it's even more obvious that these are, in fact, the same size. So here it's about the context surrounding objects. We don't interpret objects by themselves as they are, we oftentimes have to consider them in the context that surround. Here's another very similar example. So this one's a little more powerful. What people tend to see here is that this object is sort of this long, tall, thin thing, and this one on its is a little bit broader, more close to a square or something like that, not as long and thin as this one. Now this one's a little more tough to believe because it's a little more overpowering, and I included this as a printout in that little packet because when I saw this, I said, I have to print this out, cut out one of them and put it on the other. Because in fact, what I'm going to tell you is they are the same. A quick note, they're not exactly the same object. The pieces underneath, the part that make up the rest of the block, are not the same. So the overall object isn't. But this surface, this blue area, is. And so if we rotate that and flip it over that way, then we can see exactly that. And so what I want you to do is, if you like, if you want to, test whether you believe me or not. Take that home, cut out the red object, the leftmost object, and try that out. This was originally demonstrated as turning the tables. This becomes a little bit comical. This isn't the original intention of the artist who painted what I'm about to show you, but if you turn a painting on its side, if you put a painting on one of these blocks and turn it on its side, well then Mona Lisa looks a little different than normal. She looks a little broader than normal, and she actually smiles a little more than the version on the right, which is kind of nice. One more example I'll give you of how the visual context surrounding a scene will change the way we perceive it is with this chessboard. What I want you to look at is this block A here, this square A, and this square B. Now what you're likely perceiving is that those two are very different shades of gray. They are exactly the same shade of gray. It's hard to believe. I had to try like 10 different things to make sure I thought this was true. And one of them is if I place these gray bars, and these two gray bars are identical to one another, one solid shade of gray up and down both of them. Now if you look at B, you'll notice B is the same shade as those bars. And if you look at A, you'll notice that A is the same shade as those bars. And in fact, now the difference between A and B doesn't look as exaggerated even now. And that's because I've reduced the context that is doing this. I'll show you this one other way. If I get rid of all of the rest of the context and just leave A and B there, now it's obvious that they're in fact the same shade, right? So our mind interprets shadows, it interprets color context and things like that to help us really understand what's in front of us. I have a quick story about this because when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, when I first took a cognitive psychology course, my introduction to any of these topics, my professor, who studied vision actually, so he was an expert on all of this kind of subject, said that prior to moving to Los Angeles, he lived somewhere, I don't remember, maybe Oregon or somewhere very green, lots of trees and things like that. And he and his wife bought a home and they were excited, and one of the first things they did is go to the local Home Depot or paint store, and they picked out paint to paint their house. Now they both loved the color green. And at the store, they looked at a certain shade of green and said, this is a lovely shade of green. This is the green I'd like my home to be. And they went home and they had somebody paint their home. What he didn't take into mind, which he really should have given his profession and his knowledge base, is context really matters here. And so the forest surrounding their home was also different shades of green. And when they finished painting the home, that beautiful green from the store turned into a not so beautiful kind of brownish color. And so they had to do a little work to redo their paint job. So that's a real world application of how these illusions can really turn on us sometimes. Okay. So lesson 2 is that even if everyone in a group sees the same scene in the same way, we may all be wrong. But again, I want to iterate that this is not because we're all fools or something like that, but our brain is doing the best job it can with the information it has, going through its normal processes, and sometimes that leads to these errors. Here are a few more optical illusions. Now with this one, what I want you to do is let your eyes sort of pass across this grid for just a moment, and what you might notice are these sort of gray dots that happen at any intersection of the squares. Now look directly, focus at any one of these intersections, like this one, and you'll notice the gray dot goes away, but you'll also observe that all of the other intersections still have that sort of gray dot. So again, this is one of these illusions where we focus our attention seems to matter. In these two that I'll show you now, subjective or illusory contours, what I'm going to show you is how our mind tends to organize pieces of information that may or may not actually be trying to tell you something. In this case, we have all these lines pointing towards this center, and what I perceive is a circle in the middle. That seems pretty obvious. But there is no line that actually defines this circle. There is no circle really there, but this is overwhelming that that's really a circle to us, or at least we can see it that way. Another version is where if we have these three red Pac-Man looking shapes facing one another, we see a couple of things. I see one way to interpret this scene, and our mind might be doing this, is that we have three red circles with a white triangle imposed upon them, so it cuts out part of those circles. There's no triangle, there are no circles. It's simply these three red Pac-Man shapes. And the illusion is pretty easy to shatter. When you take one of these Pac-Man shapes away, now you're not as convinced there was ever a triangle there. And those circles, these two may still seem as circles with something blocking them, but the illusion goes away just a little bit. So this is an example of how sometimes people see things that are not there. I'm not talking about ghosts, I'm just talking about how our visual system can trick us sometimes. Yes, sir?
Yeah. Should I be concerned? I didn't see a person, I didn't see the dots. They weren't there, but I didn't see them. And you said a lot of people would see them.
So I don't think you should be concerned. It is a really good question. And in fact, the first thing I showed you, the rotating snakes, as that first one on the screen I showed you was called, apparently that exact image was being passed around the internet, and websites were claiming that was a stress test. So if you saw lots of rotation in that image, that means you have high stress in your life. And if you saw almost no rotation, that means you have low. But that isn't true. There is no research suggesting that that is true. Somebody, somewhere along the line, as happens with stuff on the internet, caught along that this might be a cool thing to pass around, and they did it, and some people took hold on to it. I'd give that as an example to say that I don't think whether you see these or not is necessarily indicative of any sort of processing problem or visual problem. In a lot of these, there is just some variation in how readily people see them. Yes?
I think that's the reason why they are now questioning eyewitnesses, because a lot of people haven't seen what they say and insist that they've seen or otherwise.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I would like to discuss some of that at the end. That is, in fact, maybe in line with the illusions of memory. One thing I'll try to get across is that, actually it's the next topic, but sometimes we remember things that actually in fact did not happen. Yes?
Talking about that, I remember that a college professor would have an actor pretend to be a thief, steal a woman's purse,
Yeah.
and then in a lineup, most of the students did not know who was the real thief.
Do you want to come work in my laboratory?
Why not?
How old are you, baby? This is awesome. You should keep coming to these talks. You are gaining real information. Yes, there are quite a few studies along those lines where people actually witness real events. They don't know that these events are supposed to be, that they're staged. They don't realize that they're going to be tested on this information later. They just see something happen, and then later it's revealed, by the way, that was part of an experiment. What do you remember from that? And it's really easy. So A, people don't remember all the facts. B, they sometimes produce information on their own without extra prompting that is incorrect. And C, and this is very important and has changed at least some law enforcement practice, if the officer who's questioning that individual uses leading questions, that person is much more likely to produce answers they might not have otherwise. For example, what color was the hat that the perpetrator was wearing? And in fact say the perpetrator was not wearing a hat. this witness is likely, because of sort of the power dynamic with the officer, to say, oh, well, I think it was green. Then they've just produced a completely fabricated piece of information that can change the game and the way these things are treated. So yes, I think eyewitness testimony should be much more carefully treated.
Two very good reads, which you may be familiar with outside of Skinner's box.
Sure.
Skinner box study by Leslie somebody many years ago, and a more recent study is the Unseen Gorilla, I think is the name of the book. Simon
I actually debated putting that one in, and thought with this audience there may be quite a few people who've seen that. What the gentleman here is talking about is a classic study it's basically an illusion of attention, where it's a video and there are two teams of basketball players standing on a court, one team dressed in black, one team dressed in white, and the team dressed in white is passing the ball back and forth between one another, and your job as the audience is just to watch and count the number of times the white team passes the ball. Now, the crazy part, and maybe I'll see if I can email this out to the group somehow, but in this video, while this team is doing the passing of the ball, a gorilla walks through. Not a real gorilla, a man dressed as a gorilla. They didn't want to have a real gorilla, it'd probably be dangerous. But this gorilla walks through casually. Oops. That was too casual. So the gorilla walks through and stops in the middle and beats his chest and walks through and continues on. Now, after that, the people who were in this study are asked, how many times did the white team pass the ball? And they're usually pretty close to accurate. And they say, is there anything else you saw in that video? And yes, plenty of people say, yeah, there was a gorilla. Are you kidding? Yes, of course I saw that. But a lot of people also say, no, just a game of basketball. It looked like a boring game. They were just passing the ball around.
57%, I think, if I remember.
Thank you. Okay, so over half of the people had this error of attention. Yes?
When does illusion cross over into delusion?
That is a fantastic question. I'm really uncertain how to answer that. I would say that if you're worried that somebody you know is having delusions, a doctor's visit might be in order. But it is good to know how and when some of these illusions occur, so that if you're having, or somebody you know is having situations where they're kind of seeing things that shouldn't be there or whatever, some of that just might be the brain doing its normal duty. But there are probably tests out there to look at that. That's a great question, though. In the back.
Because I have some students with me, would you define the difference between illusion and delusion?
I would say that illusion, and this is not coming from me knowing this from a textbook necessarily, I don't remember the exact definition, but I would say that illusion is when normal reality, as anybody could perceive it, is distorted somewhat with these normal cognitive processes. I would say delusion might be when the mind is actually fabricating something that just does not exist, or perhaps when the mind takes an illusion and runs with it, becomes a bit of fancy with it.